Great pleasure of working with and who I admire very much. And I mentioned Eagles before. These guys are both Eagles. They are they've raised the bar in a lot of ways, and I think you're going to see that shortly. I'm going to read straight off the script so I don't miss something here. John Broer serves as curator of Epic Stuff at Integrate, a predictive performance consultancy based in Toledo. John is a native of Toledo, has been an organizational performance consultant for nearly 25 years. His areas of expertise include corporate learning architecture, leadership and team development, people analytics, and sometimes overstating the obvious, but that seems to be needed in business these days. John has been published multiple times by Chief Learning Officer and Training Industry magazine. His clientele represents a broad spectrum, members of the Fortune 100, as well as small to mid-sized companies, and even solopreneurs. Michael Schneider is a human capital specialist for Welltower and an Inc.com columnist. He concentrates on talent management, specifically employer branding, recruiting, onboarding, and talent development. Mike believes that people are an organization's most reliable form of sustainable competitive advantage and focuses on strategies to maximize their potential. He describes himself as a people geek, HR innovator, and most important, an employee advocate. It's my great pleasure to invite John and Mike up to the stage.
I'm just gonna. Yeah. Am I live? Good deal. Yeah, that sounds good. Thanks, John. Really appreciate the intro. And I'll bring John Broer up here in a little bit. The stage is relatively small, so we figured instead of tripping over one another, we would just rotate here, which is good because we're both pacers, and I don't think this would be enough room for us. I don't know whose stage this is, but we're going to break this bad boy in today, for sure. Yes. Well, thank you all so much for having me. Very excited to talk to you today about social intelligence. Social intelligence is relatively a new science, and for some of you, this may be the first time you're hearing of the concept or the term altogether. And that's because social intelligence and research on social intelligence has only been around for the past few years. The other thing is when it comes to leadership coaching, people development, social intelligence's little brother, EQ, tends to get more of the press, tends to get more of the spotlight, emotional intelligence. So I know that emotional intelligence is a huge topic. I think we've had some presenters here at Epic on emotional intelligence in the past. Extremely important. It's kind of the path to self-mastery, right? Understanding your emotions, what drives you, what motivates you so that you can manage those things, and so that you can practice empathy with yourself and with others. But unfortunately, a lot of organizations get stuck with emotional intelligence. They get hung up. And what I mean by that is they never fully implement it. And the point at which emotional intelligence is fully implemented is social intelligence. In other words, it's the scaled up version of EQ. Now, even if you've never heard of emotional intelligence, you've definitely seen it in action. Because in the streets, emotion or social intelligence goes by a few different names. Some of these you may recognize: tact, common sense, and street smarts. In other words, it's someone's ability to navigate social situations. An incredibly important skill set. We all can think of people who are great at this, kind of light up rooms wherever they go. They are super aware of their surroundings, their environment, and they can leverage those things. If anyone was ever looking for a high-profile individual to kind of say, is there an example of social intelligence out there? Herb Kelleher from Southwest Airlines, frequently praised for this skill set. He was a patriarch in turning around that airline. Not only is it probably one of the most profitable airlines, but now one of the best companies in the world. So where did social intelligence come from? Where did it spawn from? Well, social intelligence is actually a byproduct of recent research in brain science. What psychologists have found is that our brains are literally wired to connect with other people. I won't go too deep into the weeds because I could really nerd out on you guys right now. I'm going to fight the urge to do so. But one of the coolest discoveries in this arena is a part of our brains called mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are receptors in our brains, and they literally fire in social situations, telling us to mirror or mimic other people's emotions, their actions, and their behaviors. So in real life, when this happens, you may find yourself drawing off of other people's energy, even copying their body language, or that weird thing when people yawn and then you yawn too. There's an actual science behind that, and it's these mirror neurons. And as you can imagine, that has an extreme significance inside of organizations, specifically in leadership roles. As a leader, you have the ability to affect the chemistry, the biology of those who are in your charge. So let's take a look at a couple other areas where social intelligence is applicable. Definitely helps you better understand and appreciate other people's perspectives. It helps you better understand the impact of your communication and the way that that's perceived by other people. Helps you build rapport, build better relationships, and really that is the heart of social intelligence. Whereas emotional intelligence has more of a focus on individual psychology, social intelligence is more of a relationship-based construct. So this is really that point at which you are implementing it to help you build more effective, better relationships. So you add all those things up, and it makes sense that you would probably be a little bit more successful if you possess this skill set. Now, these are not my words. These come from Daniel Goleman. Daniel Goleman is a globally recognized psychologist. He's done a ton of research on the topic, definitely one of the world's foremost experts. And he published a book called Social Intelligence, a New York Times bestseller. Would highly recommend it if anyone's interested in doing a deeper dive on the topic. But he was able to find some data and correlate social intelligence to higher or more successful leadership. All right, so you get it. Social intelligence is a big deal. But how do you go about cultivating it? How do you go about implementing it? Well, before we can do that, before we can help you scale your emotional intelligence skills, we have to create a baseline. We have to create a foundation. And to do that, we need to understand your behaviors, because behaviors is ultimately what drives our communication, drives our interactions with others. And understanding our behaviors isn't super intuitive. In the past, maybe you accomplish it through some 360 reviews. Maybe you accomplish it through some really awkward conversations with managers where you get some feedback. Maybe you ask friends or spouses. But luckily, we have introduced a tool to you today that will give you another option to do that, and that is the Predictive Index. The Predictive Index, I think we had a little over 200 people take it. If you didn't get a chance to, John Brower, who will be up here in a little bit, you can connect with him afterwards and you can take the assessment. Super easy to do, and he is a certified provider of the Predictive Index. But the Predictive Index helps us uncover these drivers to your behavior. It's important to understand your drivers because your drivers are your motivators. Your drivers and your motivators determine your needs, and your needs ultimately translate into your behaviors. So again, very important. So we will actually spend a little bit of time today and unpack some of your behaviors. So to do that, I'm not sure if anybody has their predictive indexes. Go ahead and pull that out, and we'll fly through and kind of leaf through some of those pages here. All right, so we're going to jump right into the graphs. I believe it's the very first page. We stapled it together for you. Just to give you a quick backdrop into the Predictive Index, it's an incredible tool. I know that Epic used it here last year, I believe, and the messaging was kind of centered around engagement. There are many more applications to the Predictive Index. So we're going to go through kind of looking through this through the social intelligence lens. But the Predictive Index, like I said, been around for a long time. It was initially a military application. The Army used it, and it was so effective in helping them set their recruits up for success that corporate America found out about it, sunk millions of dollars into it, and it's been scientifically validated more than 55 times now. And if you've had a chance to read through yours, you could understand probably why. They are crazy accurate, scary accurate. Out of curiosity, you guys have had these for a few hours. I believe you've picked them up this morning. Anyone have a chance to read through theirs? What'd you think? Isn't it? Yeah. I took a look at mine, and it's been 20 some odd years of me trying to figure myself out, and I still haven't, and this test did it in 5 minutes. It blows my mind. Evidently, I'm not as complex as I thought I was, but yeah, definitely a very accurate tool. What it does is it kind of hones in on your drivers, and then it helps you better understand your behaviors. More importantly, your work styles. So when we take a look at this, the first thing that you'll see is all of these graphs. These graphs is what drives the summary, drives the narrative that you had a chance to read. This is the mechanics behind the assessment. So real quickly, I just want to unpack this real fast. So you've got your self-graph. Your self-graph was, I believe, the second data bank of words, and it asked you to kind of evaluate yourself. How do you see yourself? How would you describe yourself? The first data bank of words is the self-concept graph. The self-concept twisted the instructions on you a little bit, and it said, as opposed to how you view or perceive yourself, what do you think others need or expect of you? And then the bottom one is a synthesis, and that's literally just an average of those top two graphs. They tell us much more than those things. So let's go ahead and take a look at each one. The self-graph, your top graph, by far the most important. This is the one the PI says is your most authentic form, your comfort zone. It gives us an idea to your native drives or what comes naturally. This is actual empirical evidence that such a thing as a zone exists. So I'm not sure if I'm the only weird one that would describe it this way, but there's situations in which we're crushing it. We're in the moment, an hour feels like 10 minutes, our work comes super easy, we're highly productive. We would call that being in the zone, or at least I would call that being in the zone. And from that point on, I think we spend probably the rest of our careers trying to recreate that. Some of us are successful, some of us aren't. Well, this test can do it in a matter of minutes. And if you can structure your work to this pattern, you'll by far be more productive, more efficient, and most importantly, you'll be engaged in your job. Actually like what you do. Fancy that, or imagine that. So that is the self-graph. Taking a step down to the self-concept, this one with that slight twist in instructions actually interjects a couple other variables on you. This one pulls in four main things. It's your colleagues, your manager, your role, tasks, responsibilities, or it's your company's culture. It's your environment in a different way of defining it. And it gives us an idea as to how that is shaping you, as to how it is influencing you. And what we're looking for here are areas of major adaptations, how much does it differentiate from kind of your top graph, and it also gives us an idea as to where you could potentially feel vulnerable, and whether or not you're in an environment that's conducive to your skill sets. And then the last graph is the synthesis. Now this, as we discussed in the beginning, as an average, if you kind of consider what it actually averages out, your unique skill sets, your strengths, your abilities, and then next, where you could potentially feel vulnerable, what you're internally challenging yourself to overcome, this synthesis becomes much more than just an average. This actually becomes the work version of you. So this is how you are perceived by others. So again, another huge component to social intelligence, just making sure that we're aware of how we come off to those that we work with. Now this is a graph that, in other words, if someone were to fill this assessment out on your behalf, this is potentially what they could pick. So a lot of people, when we do these things, ask me, can I have my people fill this out on my behalf? They'd be interested to kind of get the feedback. Well, if that was possible, this is likely what those options would be, or what they would look like. All right, so the most important graph is that self-graph. So because of that, we blew it up here, and we're going to show you John's and my graphs here. But before I dive into some of the insights, and yes, I hear page flips, perfect, on cue. Flip it to the next page, third page, I think, and you should have your placards. Perfect. So the placards are a blown-up version of your self-graph, the one that's by far the most important. And placard was initially designed by PI to give someone an idea on how to best interact with you in the littlest amount of time possible. So very quickly, if you're flying through it, so we've got John's up here on screen, we would know that he is interested in driving, that he wants to talk it out, that he likes variety, and that he likes flexibility. One of the major, I guess, kind of indicators here, and I think I do have a laser pointer on this, nice. The reference point is this midpoint. Now, we do not track or aren't really paying too much attention to like what side you fall on. There's no right or wrong, there's no weak or strong. But we do, however, track how far you are away from this midpoint. And the farther your skill sets are away from the midpoint, the stronger of a need that is for you, the more observable of a behavior it is, and the harder time you will have in an environment that doesn't provide those things to you. So John has some fairly strong skill sets on his profile, which we'll break through here in a second. Now, these factors, if you take a look at them real quick, I'll define them. So A stands for dominance, B for extraversion, C for patience, and D for formality. Now, we don't have a ton of time to go into this in depth in this presentation, but John and I are more than happy to connect with you offline if you're interested in really seeing all the things that this tells us, because it tells us much more than this. But organizations who are embracing the PI at Welltower, at John's company, and a lot of his clients, they literally put these up on the walls in their offices. And as people come in, they take a look at them real quick, and it allows them to kind of create some social awareness and understand how to best interact with everybody. So I thought I'd take you through kind of a quick demo of how or what this would tell me if I was interacting with John. And fortunately, luckily, I did have a chance to interact with him quite a bit. I worked with John for the better part of 2 years. So we will test my knowledge and see if I've got this narrowed down. But taking a look at this, it definitely gives me some ideas on how to best interact with him and to make sure that I maximize his skill sets in the process and to maximize my effectiveness as a communicator. So when I take a look at this, this lets me know that when it comes to being a driver, John is definitely one of those. He would kind of fit into that stereotypical A-type personality. This means that he is independent. He likes control. He'll handle it well. He likes to take the reins and run with ideas. It also gives me an idea that he's going to be a little bit more assertive in his communication style and the way that he interacts with other people. Extraversion, the B trait. So this isn't the same context in which we would normally think of or define of extraversion. I think our knee-jerk reaction is to think, well, I'm an introvert or I'm an extrovert. This is actually tracking when and where you do your best thinking. So for John, he definitely does his best thinking out loud. And anybody who spent time with him would know he has to bounce his ideas off of other people. He has to bounce them off the walls half the time. Do our best thinking out loud. You have to be a little bit more conceptual or be open to being a little bit more conceptual with people who are high Bs or Bs on the right-hand side of the midpoint. They tend to thrive on enthusiasm, thrive on ideas. So it will be a very big kind of idea-gathering information session there. Patience. So John is one that really likes variety. It does not mean that he is impatient. Means that he could potentially get impatient if something is becoming too much of a routine or if it's too much of a repetitive work. So I know if I'm working with him or communicating with him that I need to give him variety. I need to give him the ability to multitask. I need to allow him to be very action-oriented because people who like variety tend to be the natural multitaskers in the group. They know they can juggle multiple things, so they will take on many things. And then last, formality. John likes flexibility. So I know if I'm interacting with him, I should be careful not to provide too many rules, too many structures, because people who are on the left-hand side of the midpoint down here, they would actually feel like they were being suppressed if you gave them too many rules or too many structures, like you're suffocating them in a sense. There needs to be room for creativity, room to challenge the status quo, room to kind of have freedom of expression. So that's what those can tell us. Quite a bit of information, and more than happy to continue this conversation offline if anybody else has any questions on this. But I thought while we were already going through the exercise that I'd put John's feet to the fire and see if he could pinpoint some of my motivators and drivers.
All right. Mike, thank you. By the way, if you're not following Mike Schneider on LinkedIn, you need to. This is a real thought leader in our community, and you absolutely want to do this. But let's talk about the placards. So the way we put them up around the workplace gives us a little bit of insight on how to work with someone. So with Mike, what do we see? We see somebody who seeks out or prefers harmony versus driving. You also see somebody that likes to collaborate, likes to talk it out. Also, somebody that prefers stability and constancy, and somebody who likes flexibility. Mike and I would joke about this. He's not so much a rule breaker as he is a rule bender, just like I am. So we could bend him just enough when we were working together, just to get things moving ahead, but not to make people crazy. But when you put them together, this is when the real magic happens with the predictive index. You could look at this, and if we didn't have this kind of tool to help guide our communication and our social intelligence, you could see some potential roadblocks, couldn't you? I mean, Mike and I are very different on the dominance drive, all right, on that dominance behavior. I'm more of a driver, he seeks out harmony. But what we realized during our working relationship, and what I realized, is that, hey, here is somebody that really wants to collaborate, and I need to dial back the drive factor that I have. You'll also notice that when it comes to patience, we are very different along those lines. My wife would also agree with this because she's also on the left-hand side. Where I like flexibility and I like action, Mike, as you can see here, is somebody who favors stability and constancy. So I had to know, as the leader of that particular team, that this is what he needed or how we could collaborate more effectively. But do you notice two areas where we are dead set together? That happens to be on the B factor with extraversion and the D factor on flexibility. So we were able to leverage those strengths. And as Mike said, when it came to our brainstorming, putting things on the wall, that is a literal translation of what we did. My office and the workrooms where we would go were just full of Post-it notes and drawings and diagrams and charts. Not a lot of charts because we're not into charts, but a lot of that stuff because that's how we processed. So what I would encourage you to do as you start to work this social intelligence muscle is you take this back to the workplace and put these placards up. Now, you'll get a lot of questions about them if you don't have them in your workplace, but it is a tremendous way to change the way we show up, to change the way we approach someone, and really require us to be more thoughtful, tactful, and use some of those street smarts when we're talking to other people. So that is one of the powerful outputs of the predictive index. And one thing I just want to say, on your 3 graphs, you'll see 2 more scores, the M score and the E score. We're not going to get that into that today, but I do want to let you know, and I think Sarah's going to do this or John's going to do this, that in post-summit communication, I'll be hosting 2 live webinars in a couple of weeks to explain the M score and the E score if you're interested in that, just to let you know. So let's go beyond this and the placards and take a look. Oh, let's go. There we go. All right. I was just shooting the laser at somebody in the audience. I'm sorry about that. I really am sorry about that. What we have to do now is we can use the placards and more of the predictive index to start to understand our self-management. And how do we start to use and work that social intelligence muscle? Well, a lot of it has to do with how we can develop it and realizing that it is something that can be learned. Unlike IQ, social intelligence can be learned, and you can develop that. Additionally, it just requires practice and mastery, and that's why these tools out of the predictive index or any kind of assessment tool are so powerful. When we use them and we allow them to guide our development, that's when we start to see real change in our teams and our relationships and in our organizations. One of the other tools in your packet, and if you would turn to the personal development chart, this is something that's generated by the PI software. Now, this is page 1, the top of page 1 of my personal development chart. Because you noticed, as Mike said, my A factor, I'm very high on the right-hand side, so I like to drive and I like to assert. So if you'll notice this, what are my strengths? Now, we all like to talk about strengths, right? Yeah, my strengths are, okay, drives change and challenges the status quo, seeks to lead and have impact, innovative, self-motivated. We love to see those things in the big picture. But what's really important is the cautionary areas. The cautionary areas may be seen as overly aggressive, may also intimidate rather than motivate, and have difficulty delegating authority, may appear to be tough-minded and directive. And you know what? That's true. But that's also really valuable for me, isn't it? This is powerful information because now I can begin to use this and look at the self-coaching tips. Look at the very first one. Seek out and actively seek input from multiple sources. Now, here's the thing about feedback. Over at Integrate, the firm, and one of my partners, Sarah Best, is here. Hi, Sarah. Thanks for coming today. She's in the back. But on the wall, we love quotations, and I love quotations because I have nothing original to say. But one of our quotations is, feedback is the oxygen of engagement. Think about that. Feedback is the oxygen of engagement. We love to give feedback, don't we? Very few of us like to receive it. So we need to think about how to take our social intelligence even to a greater level and seek out this input. So how do we do that? Well, I'm going to share with you something from 1955 that two organizational psychologists developed called Johari's window. Now, the reason this is important is because it helps us to build social intelligence and begin to work that muscle more effectively. It helps us to build mutual understanding with others, and it enhances our relationship. So Joseph Luft and Harrington Ingham combined their first names and came up with Johari's window. And what it asks us to do, it's a very simple tool for having some introspection and becoming more self-aware. And when we look at the window itself, it looks at it reveals 4 quadrants. And in other words, it's things that I know about myself and things that others know about me. So we're going to look at 3 of these very quickly. First of all, the open area. Those are things that I know about myself, and these are things that other people know about me as well. Okay, it's pretty well common knowledge, common to all of us. However, the 2 areas that really help to shape our social awareness happen to be the blind spot and the hidden area. Interestingly enough, Johari's work, or the Harrington and Joseph's work, were really based on adjectives and descriptors, which is the basis of the science behind the predictive index and those logarithms behind what it produces. However, when we think about the blind spot, these are things that we don't know about ourselves or see in ourselves that others see. And those are things that we want to seek out. And I know your thing is like, I don't want to seek that out. Well, yeah, we really do, because that, no matter how that feedback is provided, it can help to shape who we are. And I'm going to give you some suggestions about how to do that. The other part happens to be the hidden area. These are things that we know about ourselves that perhaps others don't know. Now, I'm not talking about an extraordinary sense of personal self-disclosure and spilling your soul to people. I'm talking about things like in the workplace. If you are in a position for which you are not naturally suited, that will actually show up in the scoring in the predictive index. We can see that in the graphs and some of the scores. So we have people that are very good at what they do, but quite frankly, they're struggling. I mean, they're having difficulty with that role and what they're doing, even though they're successful in it because maybe it's not fulfilling. It's really not what I want to be doing, and they may be on the verge of leaving their company. How valuable would that feedback be to a colleague, to a manager, to say, listen, I like being here, I like the culture, but I got to tell you, this work, can we do something? Because it's just absolutely draining me. And an enlightened organization is going to say, listen, we want you to be here. We've invested in you. Why don't we just change the circumstances, modify your work a little bit? That's when we start to build social intelligence within organizations. And it happens through feedback. So the blind areas, the things we don't see in ourselves, we want to seek that out. And the hidden areas, things that we want to be able to share. And by the way, this is a whole nother session to talk about psychological safety, but that's the sort of thing that our managers need to be creating where we can have those conversations. So what do those questions look like? Well, I'm going to give you a couple of sets of questions in terms of feedback. Questions you should be asking of yourself. How prepared am I to hear the truth? That's a pretty salient question. If I'm going to ask for it, how prepared am I to hear it? By the way, when I first got into management, one of my standard practices was I would go to my teammates or to my team members during review time, and I would say, they would review me. I would say, I want to know, am I an effective leader for you? How am I supporting you? How am I developing you? I want to hear this. And I had other managers saying, why would you do that? My question to them is, why wouldn't you? Why would you not want to get that kind of information? Second question, how do I prepare myself to receive the feedback? Well, look at your PI. People with a high A, it's tough for us to take that feedback, okay? We need to marshal ourselves or guard ourselves about a reaction that could actually diminish or throw up roadblocks to that feedback. And then third, how honest am I being with myself when it comes to feedback? We all know these folks. I'm guilty of it myself. Oh, yeah, I know I got that feedback, but no, I'm really not like that. I'm fine. Everything's fine. We need to be able to take that to heart and see how it can help to shape us. So what are some of the questions you could be asking others? For example, what are the things I could work on to be more effective in my role? What could I be doing to be more effective for colleagues, my manager, my direct reports? What are the traits that I may be overplaying? One of the things that Mike said is that as you see the plotting points on the graphs move further away from the midpoint, that's like turning up the volume on those traits, okay? The closer you are to the midpoint, you're at a moderate volume. You go further out, and you're cranking the volume up. It's going to 11. Well, under stress and pressure, those get even more extreme. So, are there any aspects of my character or my behavior that I'm overplaying? Because any attribute overplayed becomes a liability. Does that make sense? Any attribute overplayed becomes a liability. And then finally, how would you characterize my effect on others? Am I a developer of people? Am I helping them? Am I hindering them? I need to know that, because what's it going to do, as tough as it may be to hear, I need to understand what that means in terms of my development around social intelligence. So this is how to unpack the predictive index and start to apply it right away in something very practical, but do it in a way that makes sense in the workplace and helps you to begin to develop that particular muscle. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Mike.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it. All right, so threw a lot of information at you in a relatively short amount of time. And John and I are going to be around. We're going to hang out for the networking hour, I think, towards the end. Feel free to come up to us if you have any questions on your PI. We can continue to dive into that. But as we take a look at some takeaways, we've thrown a lot of information at you, and we wanted to give you some tools to kind of gauge the current atmosphere, to gauge yourself, and then ultimately to gauge your organizations for social awareness. So in terms of focusing on you individually first, these are 7 traits that have been identified of socially intelligent leaders. This comes from a Harvard Business Review article by Daniel Goleman. He did a lot of research, of course, on the topic, and he distilled down the successful skill sets into these 7 traits. The first, I think everyone has a section inside of their sheets to jot these down here, so I'll give you time to do that by briefly explaining a little bit about each one. So the first one is empathy, being empathetic. Socially intelligent leaders understand and are cognizant of the emotions and the needs of other people. And they practice compassion, and they use that compassion to relate to other people, to motivate them to course correct if needed. The next one is attunement, or being attuned. These leaders, these socially intelligent leaders, actually change their radio frequencies. They tune in to the channels, to the communication styles of their employees. They adjust those things, they adapt to them to increase their communication effectiveness. This is actually something you can see inside of the predictive index. In that B trait, if you're to the right like John and I, we like more informal forms of communication. Big ideas, conceptual, enthusiasm. People who are on the left-hand side of the midpoint with that B trait like things to be more brief, brevity, pointed, detail-oriented. Organizational awareness, or being organizationally aware. Social intelligent leaders here, they are aware of the values inside of their organizations. They're aware of the sociocultural norms or some of the unspoken norms, and they are advocates for those things, and they don't fight against them. Influential. Socially intelligent leaders are able to maximize the power of their people. They uncover their passions, uncover their interests, their self-interests, and they're able to connect the dots between their responsibilities and those things. And it creates a more sustainable form of motivation and inspiration. Developing others. They understand the need for coaching, they understand the need for development, and they willingly do those things. They take people underneath their wings, and they make sure to include them. Inspirational. Socially intelligent leaders are able to, again, connect the dots. They're able to paint the picture, create a vision, and more importantly, connect each one of their employees to the big picture. And team player. They understand the importance of collaboration, and they use collaboration to, one, enhance and leverage the power of diversity and the dynamics in their team, and then ultimately to create morale in the group. All right, next we're going to take a look at how we did a quick pulse check on your organizations. So for those of you who took the predictive index, I think there was another set or sentence in there that said, hey, we've got this cool assessment called the high performance teams. Go on ahead real quick and give us some feedback there. So when you take a look at this is the results of that. Up top, just to kind of give you a lay of the land, we have areas of lower frequency. So left to right, these are the things that aren't happening as much inside of your organizations as we would like them to. And those on the bottom are areas of higher frequency. These are direct gauges of social intelligence, where there's potentially gaps and where there are potential opportunities to kind of continue to leverage those things. So up top, the areas of lowest frequency, expectations are clear, and leadership is shared. So we talked about some of the interpersonal skill sets just a moment ago. Those are two areas where they could definitely be improved by practicing becoming socially intelligent leaders. And at the bottom, these are two areas of higher frequency, potential strengths when it comes to social intelligence inside of our organizations. Diversity is valued. And when we track diversity here, this is more about diversity of thought. Diverse backgrounds, skill sets, education, and abilities. So great to see that that is up there. And another one is team members are capable and competent. A hard thing to know and to understand if you can't communicate with others, if you can't uncover their behaviors and their skill sets. So that's encouraging. We will have some follow-up communications that will go out, post-event communications on some of the articles, the research that we referenced during the presentation today. And if anyone else is interested in this research, reach out to us and we can disclose some of that, because there are many more competencies that were tracked through this survey. All right, so to wrap it up here and kind of give you an idea of everything that we covered, we kind of started off with social intelligence, what it means. We helped build some self-awareness around those things. You have incredible tools with you today, the Predictive Index. Those things are kind of unique to you, and the Predictive Index actually says that it follows you throughout your career, that it doesn't usually change. So that is a great tool for you to keep and take with you regardless of what role you're in, regardless of what you transition into in the future. We talked about and got some great pieces of advice from John on collecting feedback. Once you are aware of social intelligence, you have a tool like the PI. The only way to practice that in a sustainable fashion is to get into the habit of collecting feedback. That's the best way to kind of stay in tune with those things. And lastly, we hope that you were provided with some tools and some skill sets that you can actually take this research and this information home and actually start implementing this within inside of your organizations. So with that, I will open it up for questions here. John, I'll have you back on stage. I'm not sure if anyone has questions on the PI or on social intelligence overall, but we're happy to take the next few minutes here and knock some of those things out. We have some really cool mic thing. It's like a microphone in a styrofoam box. Is that right, John? Yeah. So toss that thing around.
Got it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And while you're looking for that, oh, that is so cool. Wow. One question I have, just by a show of hands, one of the things Mike and I were talking, and a project on which he's working is your performance management frequency in the performance management program at Welltower. And a lot of organizations are going away from the annual, sort of the traditional archaic one review a year and going to more informal check-ins, which is all about feedback. Just by a show of hands, how many organizations are going to a more regular, more consistent performance management process? Well, that's not, okay, all right. Not as many as I would have hoped, but hey, there's still hope, right? Okay.
Room for social intelligence.
Yep.
Yep.
But how are you going to know if they're holding a thing?
Yeah.
Oh, there we go.
Oh.
So how do you assure
That
yourselves?
looks so funny.
I know. It's good.
I'm sorry. Talking to the box. I'm good.
How do you assure yourselves that as managers, management evaluating the PI results for employees, how do you assure yourselves that it's controlling adequately for any type of inherent bias? Because as we
That's
all know,
great.
there can possibly be that in any organization, but especially when employees are doing it for themselves.
Yep. The PI, as Mike said, goes back to the 1950s. It's actually been validated over 500 times. And part of the validation, and also even through there's a cognitive assessment that doesn't measure IQ, it measures velocity of learning, but it is a neutral platform. And so through their validations and also, I guess, reforming and continual improvement around it, they are trying to eliminate bias out of the platform itself, and so it can be used internationally and in different areas, both the behavioral assessment and the cognitive assessment. Am I answering your question? Okay.
I got a big voice, so I even got a bigger voice now. Good afternoon. So
Hi.
specifically, it says I'm a little high energy level. Surprise, surprise, folks that know
High
me.
B?
A little bit. But my struggle is not so much to be able to adapt to what other folks are, but for that individual, because I am so intense, that it does come across as not genuine, which again pulls me into my empathy, and then I break down and cry, and it's all good after that. But how do I find that balance for somebody that it's too much for, or even that actual genuine, honest aspect where it doesn't come across as phony?
Great question. I'll take an attempt at it and feel free to jump in. Out of curiosity, when you take a look at your graph, you said you have a high B. Do you also have a high A? Is it on the right-hand side?
I have a low A. I'm sorry. I'm slow today. Yes, high A.
Yeah, we see that quite a bit. So if you have a high A, so dominant personality, and you're extroverted, you're expressive, there is a tendency or an area of caution where you could potentially bulldoze people if you're not aware of it. So John has these skill sets. I don't know if I can bounce back here. I'll probably make people sick. I'm not going to try and do it because too many animations. But now that you have the self-awareness around that, there is another component of the PI that we track called your battery. And your battery gives you an idea of the amount of energy you have to kind of self-manage. So now that you have this awareness, you're going to spend some of your battery actually holding yourself back and making sure that now you're aware of this, that you open up the floor to other people, that you maybe ask a little bit more questions, a little bit more active listening, and things of that sort. But it's all about creating the awareness and then just making sure that you manage to it.
Well, and I think a conversation around that with your colleagues. I mean, I remember, Mike and I showed you up here where, I was more of a driver and Mike is more on the harmony side, but what we shared in common is sort of flexibility with the rules. Well, there's like a third variable in here, and her name was Amanda. Amanda was far to the right on D, so she was the rule follower, and so when we would sit down, we would acknowledge and say, listen, we can sometimes get pretty far afield. Let's all work together to make sure that this comes together in terms of a plan. Same holds true with communication. You can just acknowledge and say, I know that sometimes I'm pretty bold and pretty forward. I just don't want that to serve as a barrier for our communication. And just acknowledging, I think, has a lot of impact on a relationship.
Yeah. And there is no right or wrong. We need everybody with every combination of profile here. If there was ever an underlying theme to this whole assessment, it's not that we're trying to create homogeneous profiles. We don't want everybody to be the same. We want diversity, but diversity without transparency causes friction. So this assessment helps us kind of uncover everybody's work styles and then manage to them.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
I'll take a throw those.
Hi. I'm not trying to make this be about my profile because it's kind of more of a personal thing, but I'm sure that other people have this as well. So my question is, a lot of mine are kind of more in the middle. And how do you manage that if you are not one or the other, you're kind of a little bit of both? It's a little bit more to kind of determine and justify, well, I'm more of this, but it's like, no, actually, I'm kind of both of them. So how do you manage that?
So that's really tough. It just requires a little bit more intention when it comes to those things. So if you take a look at your profiles and you've got your factors, if you are near the midpoint or on the midpoint, the PI says you are situational.
Yeah.
In other words, you can flip-flop depending upon the situation. Now, theoretically, that person is tougher to manage because they're not predictable. So we actually see like the bigger gaps being relatively an easier person to manage because they're predictable. But in those situations where you are near the midpoint, it just requires you to be a little bit more vocal about how you're feeling that day, to be a little bit more transparent when it comes to thinking that this is the way I want to approach it, or in this situation, I'm maybe leaning this way more towards the other. Because when you're there, you can see yourself having skill sets on both sides.
We say that somebody is behaviorally flexible when you're really close to the midpoint. Yeah. Just imagine a wave runner. You know how a wave runner can turn very quickly? When your behavioral pattern is very tight toward the midpoint within the first sigma, the first set of lines, that's like a wave runner, really flexible. Wide patterns, cruise ship. They can change, it just takes them a long time to change.
Yeah, I like that.
We have somebody back there. Just yell it out.
Yeah, so this definitely has an emphasis on the work environment. The skill sets and the traits that are furthest away from the midpoint, those are more dominant, and you can see some of those spilling over into your personal lives, but again, definitely an emphasis on the work environment. I'm not sure everybody's getting them today for the first time, but it was a really cool exercise for me to do mine and then to give it to my spouse and have them take a look at it, because there was a few areas where I was like, oh, I don't really know if that's me. And my wife said it was me to a T. So it may actually be more of an accurate representative or representation of you than you think. So run it past your spouses, friends, family members, see what they think. But I guess mine kind of had me nailed down.
I would only add that the top graph, as Mike said, the top graph is the most consistent over time. So you're going to bring that to all your relationships, whether it's work or at home. The second graph is the one where you adapt. That's where we would see, whether at work or at home, a lot of change. But you pretty much, that first graph is pretty consistent no matter what the scenario. And to tell you how fun the things are in the Brewer household, my wife was actually reading my PI the other day. That's what we do.
We are
Yeah.
nerds
And she-
for sure.
Yeah.
Big nerds.
Let's go to the Brewers and read the PI. But anyway, she read it, and I said, what are you doing? She said, I'm reading your PI. And I said, what are you doing that for? She said, I just think it's really fascinating. And you know what? If I had read this before I met you, I don't think I would have wanted to meet you.
Oh, no.
That is true. That is true.
So I have a follow-up to the previous question.
Yeah.
So if you are more on the midline, will you tend, I know you said that typically it doesn't change over time, but when you take this assessment, depending on how you're feeling that day, will you get slightly one side or the other? Because I know there was a number of things that I was on the midline, and I'm like, well, I think I'm more this one on this particular thing, but then I was thinking back to when I took this, and it's like, I know the instruction said, find 20-minute space where you have quiet time, and it's like, okay, well, I have 20 minutes between meetings, so I'm going to do this quick.
Right.
Yes.
So will that shift because of that adaptability?
Yeah, so what we typically see, depending upon timing, depending upon your level of skepticism, and a few other things that kind of get in there, because that happens, it happens on every assessment, we will see those shift slightly left or right, but for the most part, the pattern will stay the same shape, and that's what tells us the most about the situation. So,
Yeah.
not to get too
It
deep
might
in-
tighten up.
Yeah.
It might tighten or widen depending on the circumstance, but the shape of the pattern is generally going to be the same.
Each one of those word data banks had roughly 76, 78 words. Wow, that was really specific. Inside of it. And depending upon how many you select, it moves those bubbles left or right. So there are so many adjectives geared towards dominance, so many geared towards extroversion. So even if you're feeling rushed that day, you typically still pick kind of the same ratio or kind of the same proportion or percentage of those things. So yeah, you might have gotten a little bit more separation between them, but for the most part, it's fairly accurate. Yep. All righty.
So I'm
Thanks.
going to cut these guys off. They are going to stick around today for the social hour, and they are going to have a couple of webinars in the coming weeks to go into more detail about all of this. So if you have more questions or something specific about your PI or your team performance, they will be available. We would just like to say thank you very much
Yeah, you didn't have to.
for your time.
Thanks, John. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yep.
So what we're going